G'day, I'm Ben Lawson from Common Thread Consulting. I've produced this video for leaders at elected and executive levels of New South Wales local government to invite you to take part in what I call the service delivery reboot. You've just adopted your plans for the next 4 years and beyond, so it's now down to the business of governing, by which I mean making and implementing decisions. What I aim to convince you of is that our system of local governance, which has by and large been prescribed by state government, is not up to the task of supporting local leaders in managing or governing the most complex organisation in your local area. So when I propose a service delivery reboot, I'm likening the operating system for your council to that of a computer that we need to reboot when it ceases to function properly. Your operating system is not supporting good governance. It's not supporting your local leaders to make and implement good decisions. What do I mean by good? I mean decisions that your local communities will describe as good. One thing I want to clarify up front. This is the opposite of the old saying, a poor workman blames his tools. My argument that this is a case of poor tools, not poor workmen and women. The Common Thread framework, which is the operating system I'm offering to help you install in place of the one that state government has prescribed for you, is a management system. It's a tool to support your local leaders to govern, to manage the most complex organisation in your local area. So with that, I reckon I need to begin by establishing the fact that your system is malfunctioning, and so it needs a reboot. And I reckon the clearest evidence of that is the fact that even our Commonwealth government is inquiring into the problem of local government sustainability. The themes emerging from their interim report have been echoed in a distorted manner in the inquiries undertaken at a state level, at least in some states. But I can sum up the problem with our current operating system with reference to the way that our state government in New South Wales has framed the problem. We're not only approaching this as a financial problem, we're focused simply on the revenue side of the ledger. Nowhere in this report is the most important question when it comes to good governance around finances even posed. That question is, how sure are we that we know how much we need to spend to do what we do? That begs the question, of course, what do we do? And I'm going to define that as being to provide services, infrastructure is just another services, that our local communities need, want and are willing to pay for. So you could say that this is our answer to why we do what we do. The four colours here represent the four primary questions that define the Common Thread framework. In asking these primary questions and documenting your answers in your planning and reporting documents, you are telling a story with service as the common thread. It'll be clearer if I put it in this picture. We start with what is the present situation, then we define what our goal is, the future that we're working towards. This ship, which represents the council's organisation, led by the General Manager, is where council staff perform activities to deliver services. That's how we work towards what our goal is. The governing body, the elected councillors, steer the ship by making decisions both about the strategic direction, what our goal is, and how much resources we're putting into the ship to enable staff to get us there. This reflects the traditional split between policy and operations, or strategy and implementation, that has arguably been the defining characteristic of our operating system. The way our ship operates ever since the Local Government Act in New South Wales was fundamentally rewritten in 1993. But here's the paradigm shift in local government that I'm convinced we're yet to appreciate the significance of. And this is the introduction of the requirement in the Local Government General Regulation that councils must adopt and implement a system to manage risk. We need to be asking how sure we are that we can and will achieve our mission critical objectives. Now, councils across the state have just adopted these risk appetite statements, which is the wrong approach. And you need to recognise that this is being prescribed for you by state government, and they've completely misunderstood both the Local Government Act itself, but also the international standard, ISO 31000, the guidelines for risk management. Because we're looking at it through this traditional lens of policy and operations. So this risk appetite statement is seen as the council is defining their objective in relation to what bad things that we're going to tolerate in terms of these abstract categories of bad things. So, for example, we've got no appetite for fraud and corruption risk. We've got a low appetite for reputational risk, or we've got a moderate appetite for financial risk. The problem is that this is taking the risk management process out of context, and the context is the journey that the governing body is charting for its term in office in the delivery program. The activities that we're going to undertake to perform our services within the resources available, and it's only in this context that you can ask and answer that question of how sure we are and how sure we want to be. Those two questions aren't separate. The how and how sure are two sides of the one coin. So how we plan to do it governs how sure we are. So if we're not sure enough, then we need to change our plan, how we do it. This is what both the Act and ISO 31000 itself call an integrated approach. And that's what the Common Thread framework is. It's an integrated management system. The annual operational plan for your council is the legal means by which the governing body allocates resources by which staff with delegated authority perform activities to work towards our goals established in the delivery program. The annual report is where council reports back on its effectiveness in implementing the delivery program over the previous year. So basically, this new operating system that I'm offering to help you install is about asking and answering these 4 primary questions and documenting those in what I call a strategic service management plan, which is where you not where you make decisions. It's rather to support the decisions that you're making in your primary integrated planning and reporting documents. So we've traditionally called this an asset management plan or a risk treatment plan or an integrated water cycle management strategy or a local strategic planning statement for land use. But this is the key difference with an integrated management system. You're not charting this same journey using different terminology in half a dozen different plans. You're developing one set of plans that's integrated so that you can support better decisions by your governing body and you can support more meaningful engagement with the local community so that they can have a meaningful opportunity to participate in the decision-making process of the asking and answering these questions and so telling this story. So the defining characteristic of your current operating system, all the councils that I've seen thus far, is that the risk management framework you're developing is not integrated within your integrated planning and reporting framework, which is centred on your community strategic plan, which is the community story, and then the delivery program, which is council's role within that story. But it's even worse than that. Your IP&R documents, community strategic plan and delivery program, you're not even clear in those about what your goals are most of the time. They're defined in terms of these abstract categories that are being taken out of context, just like with those categories of risk, so financial risk and fraud risk. In the Community Strategic Plan and Delivery Program, we're talking about abstract categories like our society and our environment and our economy. None of it's grounded in the real world. And we're talking instead in terms of these bureaucratic categories. And what does that leave us with? It leaves us to focus simply on how much funding we need to keep our ship afloat. And you need to recognise that this is all the approach here is focused on. How much funding we need to do whatever it is that we do. There's no recognition of the 2 key issues. We don't know how much funding we need for our infrastructure and services, and even bigger, and these two are closely related, we're not clear that the issue of trust is not even on our radar. If you do a word search, there's only one mention in the entire 172 pages of trust. And full disclosure, it's the submission from Pat Burke, the now former Mayor of Federation Council, who I assisted in obtaining a 70% rate increase in their rates recently. And I don't have time to get into that here, but I do want to make clear that I'm convinced that that was a good decision in a bad situation. As I say, the problem is poor tools designed by state government, not poor workmen in local government. Maybe the best way to put this is fundamentally our biggest problem is the lack of trust in local democracy, not a lack of funding for our local bureaucracy. This lack of trust is a direct result of the operating system that's prescribed by state government. People don't trust the system, and there's plenty of evidence to justify that lack of trust. In this video today, I just want to focus in on one piece of evidence that justifies people's lack of trust in the system. And this proves that not only don't we have a clue how much funding we need for our infrastructure and services, that'd be bad enough, but we're not even clear that we don't know that we don't know, you could say. This is the real worry. Today, the 16th of June 2025 marks a decade since the Sydney Morning Herald ran this headline. Sydney councils shift $1 billion repair bill with accounting fiction in Fit for the Future scramble. So to give you the context here, we councils in New South Wales had been citing our big backlog as evidence of the need for more funding from the Commonwealth, but now the political winds had changed and this big backlog had put a target on our backs. We realised that state government was about to step in and solve our problems and make us fit for the future by amalgamating councils. So, for example, Ned Manoon here, who's still the Mayor of Liverpool, by the way, was given a hard time because his council had just shaved $200 million off their reported backlog of $260 million. After having used this big backlog as evidence to justify 5 years of 10% per annum rate increases. So the cynicism is understandable. And look, I'm not having a go at Ned. I was the Director of City Services at Coffs Harbour City Council for 5 years prior to this. And, I was the director at least until I was made redundant as part of our transformation to sustainability project. That's another story. But I was quoting our $80 million backlog in part to justify what I was convinced, and I'm still convinced, was a justifiable increase in rates to fund more investment in infrastructure. But what I realised after we'd put up the rates, which by today's standards, by a fairly modest 20% or so, was that this $80 million backlog I'd been banging on about had not just been reduced, but it had vanished completely. The best way to understand that is in terms of the story that we're telling here. So we gave the community a menu of service options, but boiling it down, you could say that there were three basic options. To maintain our current services, I calculated we'd need something like another $6 million in funding. That equated to a rate increase of about 20%. If people weren't willing to pay that, they could choose options on the menu to reduce services and so avoid the rate increase. But we're talking serious cuts to services. One of them, for example, was to close one or two of our 3 libraries. And it needs to be said that almost half of all the respondents to the survey voted for this option. I'm not saying that doing so would have been a good decision, but it does beg the question as to whether spending $81 million building a new library and an art gallery, museum, civic centre and administration offices in the face of vehement opposition, even within the council chambers, was a good decision. So I think I can say clearly that it wasn't a good decision because the community told council that it wasn't a good decision. In the community survey in 2022, if I added the ratings that weren't on this chart here, the community's rating for council's performance in relation to whether they had a good understanding of the community's needs, whether they listened to and respected the community's views, whether they clearly explained the reasons for their decisions, all of those are rated half as low again as the areas rated closest to terrible on the chart. So you can see the lowest on the chart are the overall value for money from rates, and the other one is consultation. Those are rated at just 30%, but these other measures are about half of that, 14 or 15%. And look, I'm not having a go at anyone at the elected or executive levels of my city. I seek only the shalom of my city, as Jeremiah tells the Jews to seek while exiled in Babylon. The problem is not the workmen, but the tools. Think about it. How could I possibly blame any one of the people in charge at my council? The people have all changed over the years, but the problems remain. And look, it's the same problems. A few weeks after I arrived in Coffs in 2010, my boss, Stephen Sawtell, was sacked, and you can see here the advocate is asking why, understandably. And one of the reasons Graham Singleton suggested we might have, that Stephen might have been sacked, was the refurbishment of Council's new office administration, which I'm pictured standing in front of here at Rigby House. And look, my lips are still sealed, but my point is that my new boss, Steve McGrath, who eventually replaced my old boss, was, after I'd spent a few months in the hot seat doing my best to steady the ship, Steve took over, but after a few years he was sacked by the governing body over council's next office construction project, that $81 million project that I mentioned, the Urilla Place project. And then most recently, after the latest election, our next GM who replaced Steve, Natalia Cowley, she technically resigned, but I look at the council minutes and 4 of our 9 councillors voted against that motion to accept her resignation. So it's pretty clear there's another side to that story. My point is that it's clearly not the fault of any particular person because all the people are changing. Each of our mayors changed. They followed the GMs out too. Keith Rhodes, Denise Knight, Paul Amos. So clearly it's not the people. It's the system created by state government that's the problem. So anyway, my point is that back in 2013, we gave the community an option to cut services to avoid a rate increase, and we gave them an option to pay more than the 20% increase that I'd calculated we needed to maintain current services. So you can see here the size of those palm trees on the right-hand side. They're growing with the size of the level of service that we can provide. But in terms of that improved service level option, at most there was 25% of people voted for a higher level of service, and that was in relation to roads. In relation to most services, the community voted to maintain the current level of service. And I won't go into the details now, that'll have to wait for another video, but I want to just show you briefly that we offered a menu of options. So you can see here for lifeguards, there's the option of maintaining the current level of services, explains what the current service is. 12 months of the year there's a beach patrols at Park Beach, there's a few months at Sawtell and some of the other beaches, and that costs about $600,000 a year. So if you want to pay more or less, if you want better services, then here's how much it costs. And then over the right-hand side, you can see the being tallied up the implications of these service level choices overall. So put simply, you can't have your cake and eat it too. There's a lot more to all of this, particularly when we went out and asked the community again, are you sure you want to pay more for better services? You've told us you want to maintain the service, but are you willing to pay? So that's another story. But in general, the community told us they were willing to pay to maintain the current level of service, but they weren't willing to pay any more to increase the level of service. And so that's why I came to the very difficult conclusion that the $80 million backlog I'd just been banging on about for the last couple of years to justify our rate increase had just vanished. In the report that I wrote to Council's meeting of the 28th of November 2013, still available on the website if you want to check it out, I celebrated the fact that we were breaking new ground in transparency, accountability and involvement of the community. Well, I've got to say that ground is well and truly crusted over again, not just in Coffs, but across the state. Just to be clear, I'm aware of very, very few councils who undertook a similar exercise to what we did at Coffs then or since. I'd argue that many who claim to have done it are dressing up a very different beast. And I'll give you a very simple test to identify whether your operating system really works like this or not. It all comes down to what we think the story is about. And the system prescribed by state government might claim otherwise. It might describe it otherwise in theory, but in practice, it's really only focused on how much funding we need for the bureaucracy. And so the question for the community, the passengers on the ship, is whether they have the capacity to pay however much we need to do whatever it is that the bureaucracy decides that we're going to do. So, for example, at Coffs, we decided to spend $81 million building a new monument to ourselves. And look, personally, as a ratepayer, I still I think that was a bad decision, and I think the community response in the survey bears that out. But it would have been a good decision if the community if we'd been through a democratic process and the governing body had made a decision about how council should carry out its functions, including a goal of providing a bigger library and a new civic centre and administration offices, in a way that provided the best possible value for money with the rates that we've got. But that's not what happened. There wasn't this question, there wasn't clarity about what the community values for the money that is available. And it's not just my opinion. So that's what the survey is saying. This is a complex decision about a complex organisation. So we need a new and a different operating system to be able to manage it. That's what the Common Thread framework's about. And so here's the simple test, whether your system operates this way. Is your system of local governance focused not just on the community's capacity to pay, but rather their willingness to pay? I need to clear up a misconception. We've convinced ourselves that our local communities just aren't willing to pay more in rates because we're facing a cost of living crisis. And I don't in any way diminish that that's a real problem, but it's not the fundamental problem. Again, our fundamental problem is the lack of trust in our local democracy, not a lack of funding for our local bureaucracy. And I'm going to offer you what I think is some incontrovertible evidence that this is the case. When Kerry Packer appeared before the Senate inquiry into corporate tax avoidance in 1991, he said he was doing so reluctantly, and it's no wonder given that Four Corners has just recently run a story that suggested he was evading tax. When the chairman repeated that accusation, Packer burst up and he said he wasn't evading tax in any way, shape or form. But of course he was minimising his tax. And warming to his theme, he turns to the gallery because I think he recognised that he was speaking for the rest of us when he said that If anyone in this country doesn't minimise their tax, they want their heads read, because I can tell you that as a government, you're not spending it as well as you could be, that we should be donating any extra. My point is this. Packer was Australia's richest man. There's no cost of living crisis here. The problem is not capacity to pay, but willingness to pay. Yet this is the same bloke who just 1 year earlier, after suffering a heart attack during a polo match and then being revived by a passing ambulance, which was one of the few at the time that was equipped with a portable defibrillator, Packer is said to have rang the then New South Wales Premier from his hospital bed, and Nick Greiner recounted later on that Kerry had said to him, "I'll make you a deal. I'm told it costs about $5 million to put one of these defibrillators in every ambulance. I'll go you halves." And that's how we got defibrillators into every ambulance in our state, and why they were subsequently known as Packer Whackers. Think about it. Packer told the Senate inquiry that he didn't think the government was spending the money they got so well that he was willing to donate any extra. But here he is. He's a year earlier making a $2.5 million donation. So that's why I say our fundamental problem, and this is not with federal or state government or local government, but with our federal system of government generally, is the lack of trust. So back to the recent inquiry, as I say, it just wasn't on the radar. Pat from Federation was the only one that mentioned it. And in case you still think that this is just my opinion, this lack of trust issue, consider this report from the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, IPART, which was published a year earlier than the inquiry's final report. And to those who aren't familiar, IPART administers our operating system for local government. They determine both the annual rate peg, which is the maximum amount that councils are permitted to increase rates by, and applications from councils to increase rates above the peg, which are known as special rate variations. So it's like the 70% one that I helped Federation get. So now, in the terms of reference for this review, the New South Wales Government reiterated their commitments, both to protecting ratepayers from excessive rate increases, in other words, ensuring rates are affordable and don't impact on our cost of living, and they were also committed to ensuring councils are financially sustainable. But here's the thing, when we focus simply on the funding, our operating system is just a zero-sum game where it's either rates are unaffordable or councils are unsustainable. To their credit, IPART recognised the problem here. The way they've described the system, described the problem, reinforces my point. They've said that there's a problem with the financial model. The financial model is broken, and you want both affordable rates and sustainable councils. Computer says no. To their credit, IPART also recognised that trust in the sector is a key concern. But here's the thing. Trust is not a financial issue. It's not about economic value, but what we value, which is service delivery. We need to approach this situation differently. And as Christopher Watkins puts it, we need to diagonalise this false dichotomy. We need to bridge the gap between ratepayers and their local communities, then their local councils. And that means focusing not on funding, but on value, value for money. And it also means telling a story with service as the common thread, because it's services, what we all value and what we need the money for, the economic value, that's what bridges the gap. Or to put it more precisely, our operating system needs to focus on the activities that need to be carried out by council staff with the resources allocated by the governing body to work towards what our goal is for services that the local communities need, want, and are willing to pay for. Unless our local leaders are asking these four questions, what, why, how, and how sure, and documenting their answers in their council's integrated planning and reporting documents, and giving their local communities an opportunity to participate in that decision-making process, in telling this story, then all we're left with to focus on is funding for the bureaucracy. And that's exactly what we see here. Like I say, the inquiry failed to recognise that trust in the system is a fundamental problem, but they also failed to ask this how sure question. How sure are we that we know how much we need to spend to do whatever it is we do? The fact is that we're not at all sure. And here's the kicker. The decisions about what council does, the services you deliver, are not agreed by a process that gives local communities a meaningful opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. And that's why this notion of willingness to pay is simply ignored. It's not on the radar of the current operating system. It's particularly conspicuous by its absence from the government's response to the inquiry's final report. Now, this here represents your only practical alternative to addressing your financial challenges by rebooting your operating system in the way that I'm offering to help you with. The government has said that it intends to prepare legislative and regulatory changes that are separate to the special rate variation process, which is the process covered by these guidelines, and which the government claims with this new process will remove these bureaucratic requirements and so make it easier for councils to increase rates. But there's nothing in this new comprehensive spending review process that doesn't fit within the current special rate variation process in those guidelines. So here's the government proposing to remove bureaucracy by creating an extra layer of bureaucracy, more regulations and legislation on top of what we've already got. And perhaps, I guess the only thing that the government might see as different here is that they're talking about this focusing on council resourcing based on community need, instead of just the current focus, which is IPART's focus in administering the guidelines at the moment, which is council's need for the money. But criterion 1 of the special rate variation guidelines is clear. There's 2 options by which councils can articulate the need for the increase in rates. Either council's need for the money, how IPART does it now, or the community's need for the service and the limited availability of resources for council to provide that service. And that's the way that we approached we told our story at COFS back in 2013, and the application that was approved in 2014. So the government claims that this new comprehensive spending review will focus on the community's need for the service, but the evidence is clear that the government's got no idea how to quantify that. The story that councils are telling in this regard is still being quantified in terms of this abstract thing called the infrastructure renewal backlog, which is still just accounting fiction. But as I said earlier, there's this simple test to identify how your operating system really works. And this is just dressing up your bureaucracy as another beast, because there's no mention here of willingness to pay. The government said here that IPART will consider whether the community has the capacity to pay. So let's not beat around the bush. The government's proposal to fix your council's finances is geared up to making it easier for you to impose a rate increase on your local communities that they are unwilling to pay for. All that's going to do is further undermine the trust that the survey from IPART has already identified as a real problem now. 2/3 of ratepayers pretty much are saying they don't trust councils. And to their credit, IPART has recognised that is a fundamental problem. As I say, IPART's commissioned a survey of New South Wales ratepayers that found almost 2/3 are not comfortable trusting councils to keep rate increases reasonable. IPART suggested this lack of trust arises from an insufficient level of communication. Now, think about it. Even small councils like Federation are publishing well over 1,000 pages of plans and reports to justify themselves. I'd argue that's not insufficient, that's excessive. But that's how it all comes down to how we frame these questions. And when we frame it the wrong way, we're missing the point. The real question is whether ratepayers should trust IPART and ultimately New South Wales government to keep your rate increases reasonable, because councils don't have the power to increase rates. Only IPART does. And in this regard, consider figure C4 here from IPART's report. This busts the myth that rate pegging is the cause of your financial sustainability woes in New South Wales local government, because over the last decade, rates have increased at double the rate peg. Might be clearer if I put it like this, and I've drawn on slightly different figures, but it's telling the same story. Over the previous decade, rates increased by about almost $1 billion, or 27% from the rate peg alone, but they increased by $1.1 billion on top of that, or another 33%, so we're talking 60% all up, and more than half of that on special rate variations. And so basically, rates are going up by double the rate peg. So the special rate variation process administered by IPART is erecting bureaucratic barriers to make it harder for councils to increase rates, but it's certainly not putting a handbrake on rates overall. But it gets worse, because IPART's analysis that follows shortly thereafter found that despite rates increasing at double the rate peg over the last decade, the financial position of councils has deteriorated over the latter half of that period. And it gets even worse, because that was the 5 years after the most concerted effort in the history of local government in New South Wales by state government to improve the financial position of New South Wales councils. This is Mike Baird saying here in his article in the Herald that the forced mergers are designed to free up cash for infrastructure and services and put downward pressure on rates. Now, the evidence is clear that these efforts have in fact delivered the opposite. Rates have gone upward, particularly in councils that have merged to make them fit for the future, and Federation was one of those. But here's the real concern. Given that our rate increases excuse me, are being justified solely based on capacity to pay, because over this decade of rate increases at double the rate peg, the impact was at most an extra 0.1% of the typical household budget, which is for rural ratepayers here. But even those paying the most as a portion of their income, ratepayers in regional councils, were only paying about 1.5% of their typical income on rates. And so between that and the fact that rates in New South Wales are still significantly lower than those in Victoria and South Australia, up over 2%. The economists are going to tell us that on this basis, ratepayers have the capacity to pay significantly more than they do now. But does this mean that the increase in rates is reasonable? It depends what we mean by reasonable, doesn't it? And that depends on how we define our basic measures of success in local government. It's common sense why people are saying that the rate increases are unreasonable. It's not because of the rate peg, it's because councils are kicking the can down the road for a decade or more until their situation is desperate, and then applying for an increase of 50% or more, like I've shown here. This is what's unreasonable and unaffordable. And I need to clarify that, yes, Federation increased their rates by 70%, but after the merger, the state government froze their rates for 4 years, and then IPART half knocked back their last special rate variation application back in 2023. It's another story, but what I'm saying is it's poor tools, not poor workmen. I'm not having a go at Federation. They're doing the best they can with a poor set of tools. And this is not what is in anyone's best interest to keep operating this way. So as I said at the start, the Service Delivery Reboot is about supporting local leaders to govern the most complex organisation in your local area, which is your local council. I define good governance as making and implementing good decisions. And I define good decisions as ones that your local communities will describe as good. And of course, that's not going to include imposing rate increases of 50% or more that they aren't willing to pay. I've said that the Common Thread framework is about asking 4 primary questions: what, why, how, and how sure, and documenting your answers in your integrated planning and reporting framework documents, your delivery program, your community strategic plan, your operational plan, and your risk management plan, if you like. It's about learning to tell a true story with service as the common thread, instead of continuing to tell this fictional story in accounting terms that we've been focused on for the last decade, and which it seems like we're now not even asking the question about whether this is a true story or not. We're not even interested in the question. We're just focused on how much more money we need. So there's no hope for this in anyone. This is not how we want to continue, surely. So I want to finish off here by explaining what I mean by a true story. I mean a story that is grounded in reality. That's the trouble with the way that we're telling a story now. We're dealing in abstractions, not just in relation to these financial performance measures like the backlog, but themes in our community strategic plan, our society, our economy, these abstract categories of risk like financial risk or fraud risk. These are all being taken out of context. What I mean by a true story is putting things back into context, grounding the story that we tell through our planning and reporting in reality. And that means we've got to start with the real world. We've got to identify our real world challenges, things that our local communities value, things that they want to see fixed. And I'm not just talking about things that council's directly responsible for. So an example here, so this is the community strategic plan, but it's also your delivery program. They're different layers, if you like, within the same plan. So as an example here, there's an empty GP clinic, and technically the provision of state and federal government of health services is a responsibility of state and federal government, but any community in the bush will tell you that those who want to actually get a doctor there have actually got to provide some facilities for them. And even so, I'm working with a few councils that they've got facilities and they're still struggling to get doctors there. So this is about your community's vision for what you need, what our goal is. So we want to get a doctor at least for a couple of days a week. We want to fix that flooding problem. We want a new footpath in front of the nursing home. We want some new sports amenities. But of course, because our resources are limited, we can't afford to do everything. We need to prioritise, right? So maybe we can't afford new sports amenities, but we really want to see those flooding issues addressed or at least mitigated. We really want that new footpath, and we really need a GP. So that then comes down to the question of, well, how much does it cost to do it all? So instead of telling a story like this is how much we're going to increase your rates by, whether you like it or not, because we reckon you've got the capacity to pay more. This is about developing a shared story about how council plans to deliver what we value, the services that our local communities need, want, and are willing to pay for. And crucially, sitting behind this is the other part of the story, which is the how sure question. How sure are we that we can and will deliver these outcomes for our local communities? And it's a different element to the operating system. This is where staff has that are below deck have a key role to play to provide assurance to those up above deck steering the ship. But for now, I'll just point out that there's a very close link between providing assurance in relation to our mission critical objectives and earning people's trust that we can and will deliver what our local communities need. This is a very different way of telling the story to the accounting fiction that you can see we've been telling for a decade now. As of today, it's a sad anniversary. So look, I hope that sounds like it's of interest. If you'd like to find out more, you can explore more content. I'm planning on making some more videos and putting them up on my website, commonthreadconsulting.com.au. And I hope to hear from you soon. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and goodbye.